Awesome. Welcome to eWeek 2022. I am very excited to kick off this engineering week with Dr. Reed here. She's going to be speaking about Black history, present, and future.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this opportunity to come in front of all of you and to give this presentation. Thank you, Erica, for being willing to reach out to me so that I can have this opportunity. So before we get started with my presentation, Black History, Our Present, and Black Future, the gift, the curse, and the discovery therein, I first want to make a land acknowledgement to the original inhabitants of our country, to the original inhabitants of the Southfield area, where the Three Fires tribes, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, and the Odawa tribes, they were a part of this land, and that they are still here, that even though we may not always see them, but we recognize their strength and what it was that they had to give up in order for an institution like Lawrence Technological University could be here in this space. And so while they are the stewards of the land, that we indeed are doing our best to make sure that we are being collaborative, that we are creating a partnership that is strong, and that we are doing all that we can to not only support our Native brothers and sisters, but to ensure that their engagement, their comfortability here at Lawrence Technological University. So we have a few objectives that we're going to cover today in regard to my presentation, and I also have some ground rules that I want to cover as well. So we're going to talk about the historical connection of DEI concepts to engineering today, but understand that they may have some overlap in other areas of your life. We're going to talk about and describe how diversity, equity, and inclusion is an asset to design thinking, because I think that's very important when you're talking about how we're going to engage with our communities moving forward. We're going to talk a little bit about those little-known Black inventors and innovators in engineering. And then we're also finally going to connect today's lecture to what it is that we can begin to do right now so that we can solidify the future, okay? In terms of ground rules, this particular presentation will make people uncomfortable, and that's okay. I want you to be uncomfortable. I want you to be uncomfortable enough to want to learn more. I want you to be uncomfortable enough to figure out where your place in this history is, and I want you to be uncomfortable enough to know that you can help to dismantle the systems that have been put in place, okay? All right. But before we do all of that, before I make you uncomfortable, I'm going to tell you a story, because I think that's very important. So there are two young fish that are swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. The older fish acknowledges them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish look at him. They kind of swim away a little bit, and eventually one of them says, "Well, what the hell is water?" Okay, this is a story, This is Water, by David Foster Wallace, and he goes on to discuss the immediate point of the story, which is that the thing that is most obvious, the most ubiquitous, the most important realities that are often in front of us are often the ones that are the most difficult to talk about. And the main reason for that is our self-centeredness, okay? In our worlds, we are the center of our world. And our hardwired default setting is that we're focused on ourselves, we're focused on our feelings, we're focused on our wants, our needs, our deep beliefs, and they're often reinforced in a number of ways, by the things we learn from our families, by our communities, the media that we tune into, the stories we read, the movies we watch, the music we listen to. We just can't help it. Being in the center is always reinforced. And that more times than not, we're not very good at being willing to adjust our lens to consider other people's experiences, their lived experiences. We will more times than not engage in a rhetoric or express emotion just to prove our rightness and someone else's wrongness. However, we have to begin to do the work to dismantle the system that has served as the great gatekeeper to this hostile obstacle course called life. And that every course is as unique as the fingerprints that we have, and that even when our similarities run parallel to what our differences are, we need to be able to acknowledge it. So I want you all to be able to use this time and this opportunity to consider what you have not had to consider in engineering. So, historical context matters when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion first, and I think that it's important to kind of lay that groundwork first. So you have to be able to see it from its societal context, its societal impact, and recognize that there has been systemic injustice and discrimination that has contributed to the ever-widening gap of disparities in whichever way you begin to look at disparities. And we have to acknowledge that there have been scores of people, of Black people and people of color, that weren't given their accolades during their lived experiences for the way that they made our lives easier. So let's take a nice little trip down history's lane. So all of you are well aware of 1619, right? That is the point in time where it was documented of the first slaves that were brought to what's now called the United States of America. So throughout the 17th and the 18th centuries, people were kidnapped from the continent of Africa, or they were forced to come to the continent of Africa, from the continent of Africa over to the United States in a forced slavery and indentured servitude. If we fast forward a little bit, we find that by the mid-19th century, America went through westward expansion, and there was the abolition movement that came about. In November of 1860, President Lincoln was elected. Months later, Southern states began to secede. Jefferson Davis was appointed the first president of the Confederate States of America. And in 1861, the Civil War started. So you're talking about a war that went on for 4 years. So in 1865, the Civil War ended. 4 million enslaved people were now freed. They've given their walking papers and said, okay, you're free to do things, and yet they weren't necessarily given the resources. In 1865, we had the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery and servitude in all circumstances, except for punishment for crimes that were committed. And the loophole resulted in Southern states passing what's called the Black Codes to criminalize activities that would make it easy to imprison, at this time, African Americans, and effectively put them right back into servitude once again. The Black Codes were an effort to re-implement slavery as best as they could up under the law. So we're talking about systemic processes put in place to hinder a group of people from being able to live out their lives post-Civil War. Mississippi and South Carolina, they were the first to issue Black Codes. At Mississippi, a former slave had to show proof of employment every January. If they left their employment before the end of the year, they were forced to forfeit their wages and were subject to arrest. In South Carolina, if Blacks worked in any other occupation besides farm or servant, they were subject to an annual tax. And failure to pay would lead to forced servitude on a plantation. Blacks were unable to own guns or knives. They were prevented from voting. There were laws that were passed requiring ownership of property to show that they owned property. Poll taxes and unpassable literary tests kept people from voting. It did everything but kill a person. Everything but kill a person. In 1866, Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau and a Civil Rights Bill of 1875. So the Freedmen's Bureau Bill was established as a temporary organization to assist refugees and formerly enslaved persons, while the Civil Rights Act of 1865 kicked off Reconstruction. And when combined with the 15th Amendment, Black people began to get elected into state legislatures and Congress. Well, that seemed to be too much for people because in 1883, the Supreme Court found the act unconstitutional because while private entities couldn't discriminate, government could, thus weakening the 13th and the 14th Amendments and supporting discrimination with an 8-to-1 vote. Can you imagine putting into law that it is okay to discriminate with an 8-to-1 vote? So there continue to be barriers for people of color, for minorities, for women, for immigrants. And there was always this unequal treatment, and we'll come back to that momentarily. Up until 1964, African Americans mainly in the South were legally banned from using public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, water fountains, restrooms. So when you kind of go back and you look at those different things, there really was a division that was put in place. There were Jim Crow laws that were passed, like an update. Think of it as an upgrade to the Black codes, where racial segregation was enforced in the state and local laws, and it limited where Black people and people of color could work, where they could live, what they could do. And it was all enacted in the late 19th century, early 20th century. These laws were enforced until 1965. That was not that long ago. So at this point, so we're talking 1965, I want to play a video from Howard University's commencement. And this is President Johnson that spoke. Ooh, nope. Oh, Erica, I may need your help. Sorry, excuse us. There we go. Thank you.
Dr. Nabrith, my fellow Americans, I am delighted at the chance to speak at this important and this historic institution. Howard has long been an outstanding center for the education of Negro Americans. Its students are of every race and color, and they come from many countries of the world. It is truly a working example of democratic excellence. Our earth is the home of revolution. In every corner of every continent, men charged with hope contend with ancient ways in the pursuit of justice. They reach for the newest of weapons to realize the oldest of dreams, that each may walk in freedom and pride, stretching his talents, enjoying the fruits of the earth. Our enemies may occasionally seize the day of change, but it is the banner of our revolution they take. And our own future is linked to this process of swift and turbulent change in many lands in the world. But nothing in any country touches us more profoundly, and nothing is more freighted with meaning for our own destiny than the revolution of the Negro American. In far too many ways, American Negroes have been another nation, deprived of freedom, crippled by hatred, the doors of opportunity closed to hope. In our time, change has come to this nation too. The American Negro, acting with impressive restraint, has peacefully protested and marched, entered the courtroom and the seats of government, demanding a justice that has long been denied. The voice of the Negro was the call to action. But it is a tribute to America that once aroused, the courts and the Congress, the President, and most of the people have been the allies of progress. Thus, we have seen the High Court of the country declare that discrimination based on race was repugnant to the Constitution and therefore void. The Scripture promises, "I shall light a candle of understanding in thine heart, which shall not be put out." Together, and with millions more, we can light that candle of understanding in the heart of all America. And once lit, it will never again go out.
So that was Lyndon B. Johnson. So he'd mentioned a couple of different things. So there's some key legislation that I think is important to also reference in having this particular conversation. So, of course, John F. Kennedy, the president before Lyndon B. Johnson, before his untimely demise, issued the Executive Order number 10925. And this particular order used affirmative action for the first time by instructing federal contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants were treated equally without regard to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And it also created the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, the EEOC. This act was then signed into law in July 1964 by President Johnson, and it prohibited discrimination in public places, provided for the integration of schools and other public facilities, made employment discrimination illegal, and it was the most sweeping set of changes for the civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Okay, remember, it was 1875 for the first civil rights bill. And now we're talking almost another 100 years later. President Nixon then went on to build on Johnson's legacy in 1969 with the federal Philadelphia Order, which set specific goals and timetables for federal contractors to hire shares of minorities reflecting the racial makeup of their local area. So if you had a city like Philadelphia, where I'm just going to give out an arbitrary number, 75% of the inhabitants are Black people and people of color, your workforce should not be the inverse of that, that it should mirror the place where you live. But there were other key legislations that were both before and during this time. So Plessy versus Ferguson was ruled in 1896, and under the 1890 Jim Crow segregation law, it mandated separate railway cars for whites and African Americans, so thus creating the separate but equal clause. Okay, it was a landmark decision, and it was upheld on the constitutionality of racial segregation laws for public facilities, that as long as segregated facilities were equal in quality, we have separate but equal. And yet, in going through history, looking through our history books, we can see that separate never really meant equal either. In 1951, a little girl by the name of Linda Brown was denied entrance into Topeka, Kansas's all-white elementary school. Her father was the one to fulfill the class action lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka, and in his lawsuit, Brown claimed that schools for Black children were not equal to schools for white children, and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which holds that no state can deny to any person within jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. In 1954, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren delivered the unanimous ruling in the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education, saying that state-sanctioned segregation of public schools were in violation of the 14th Amendment, therefore rendered unconstitutional, and that the United States Supreme Court legalized that it was unconstitutional and a violation of that amendment to have separate schools for no other reasons than race. And it was one of the earlier renowned cases that raised awareness for the need of racial equality in education, but it also served as a source of inspiration for other minorities seeking equal opportunities in non-educational areas in the United States of America. So when we're talking about that timeline and we're putting it into context, we can see that things have not always been as they seem. So you're talking 1619, slavery coming to North America, 1861 to 1865, the Civil War and Emancipation. This 1896, the Supreme Court establishing the separate but equal doctrine. 1909, the NAACP was founded with the goal of abolishing forced segregation, enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments, and equal education. In 1920, the Harlem Renaissance. 1941 to 1945, 3 million African Americans registered to serve in the armed forces. 1947, Jackie Robinson becoming the first African American to play on a Major League Baseball team. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. 1955, Emmett Till's murder. 1963, the Birmingham church bombed, killing 4 little girls inside. Dr. King giving his I Have a Dream speech. The Civil Rights Act being passed in 1964, Malcolm X being assassinated in 1965. The Fair Housing Act in 1968, thus eliminating redlining, which of course we still see the impact of redlining today. Dr. King being assassinated. 1972, Shirley Chisholm running for president. She was the first Black woman to run on a ticket to become president of the United States. 1992, the LA riots. The Million Man March in 1995. I remember watching the Million Man March in 1995 on CNN. 2001, Colin Powell becoming Secretary of State. And in 2008, Barack Obama becoming the 44th President of the United States. That's a lot of change in a really, really, really short amount of time. So I want to put out a discussion question, which I think is actually going to be difficult with the handful of people that are here in the audience. So why do you think it's important to have an understanding of United States history to the overall discussion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering as a career choice? And what does it mean for the future of engineering and creating opportunities for others? And I believe that I'd asked this question previously in another presentation similar to this. Because for all intents and purposes, we can't talk about career opportunities without talking about the historical context connected to career opportunities. We have to face head on that real-world barriers were put in place to keep a caste of people from being able to live out life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's just the honest-to-goodness truth. That is our history. It's not something that anyone should feel proud of, but we should be able to acknowledge it and say, I think it's now time for us to right those wrongs. So that is something that I want all of us to continue to think about as I continue this presentation. So with that being said, just a quick temperature check. How well do we understand the topics so far? 5 being, yes, I understand very well. And 1 being, I don't get it. I don't get it at all. How does this compute? So just a quick show of hands. So, okay, thank you. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty about diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering and why it's critical. So engineering has changed lives and systems and transformed society in many, many, many ways. Like, for example, who do we need to thank for indoor plumbing, right? Like, whose hand do I need to shake for creating the heated steering wheel in our cars and heated seats? Hello, anybody, right? But at the same time, who do we need to judge for creating traffic circles? Who do we need to judge? Or what about Roombas? Both friend and foe, right? So we can see that engineering technology, engineering systems, has indeed changed lives. And yet, because engineers are people too, we all have blind spots. And there are unintended consequences that show up because we're all shaped by our cultures, our cultural biases, and we don't tend to think outside of the realm of people that we're always around. We just don't. And what tends to happen when that happens is that we begin unintentionally, or maybe even intentionally, to bake inequality into the systems that were created. So I want you all to think back. We might be dating ourselves, but when there were crash test dummies, almost all crash test dummies early on were patterned off of the male body. It did not think about what happens to a woman or what happens to a child. In fact, I don't even think that began to happen until the mid-'80s, late 80s, when it was determined that, oh, car crashes impact different bodies in different ways, thus creating the need for the seatbelt. Hello, somebody. Okay. Or what about algorithms that tend to serve as gatekeepers? One of the movies that I often enjoy and am frightened by is Minority Report, right? You remember the movie Minority Report? It was like, oh, look at all the different things that were happening. And yet you would almost always see the algorithm skewing more towards persons of color when there was a crime or something that was potentially going to be committed. And we're seeing that in real time. There was an article that I read not too long ago asking the question, can soap dispensers be racist? And it was because those sensors for the soap dispenser could not see skin color. So can you imagine going to the bathroom, needing to wash your hands, as you should, public service announcement, trying to put your hand up under the soap dispenser, and the soap dispenser not working for you, but working for the white person that's next to you. That they have to be the ones to make the soap dispenser work for you so that you can wash your hands. Something as simple as a soap dispenser, making it actually difficult to do what you should be doing, which is washing your hands. Or what about when we talk about how to improve mobility for disabled persons? You do realize that disabled persons often aren't thought about when creating things, right? There's a whole page dedicated to engineering failures of things being created and not considering other people in that. You know, we have, and I've talked about this before, the Americans with Disabilities Act to thank for making getting into any building, crossing a street easier, because it finally began to realize that wheelchairs needed to fit through doors. And not everyone had the mobility to take a step off of a curb. That's why you see those dips that are cut out in curbs. Or even those road bumps. You know, they're good for all people, especially now in our day and time when we're more glued to our cell phones and we're looking down. Those bumps help you realize, hey, you might be coming close to the street. Please take a moment to look up just long enough. So that's why it's important to have all kinds of different people at the table. So because we know that technology is something that can improve productivity, we should be able to also understand that it can exacerbate inequality too. And again, we have to think about who we're around all the time, who is at the table and who's not at the table. So when we think about those teams that are created, those teams are often slivers of society that we see. They're slivers. So we have to think about it. Reporting doesn't always include women or people of color when reporting is done. In 2019, of the 1.7 million engineers that were of prime age, 81% of those engineers were either white or Asian, and 84% were men. So completely cutting out a cross-section of people. And for those that have one or more disabilities, the unemployment rate is sky high. All of this is documented. All of this is documented. So then when we begin to think about the human-centeredness of design, we also have to be empathetic in thinking about other people and their own experiences. We have to have a deep understanding of the problems that show up for people. Like when we think about those things that are invented or created, it's because someone thought about a problem that they were having and wondered, I wonder if other people are having this issue too. It's like the great hack when you finally figure something out. I watch TikTok videos, and I'm a parent, And when I see a hack that another parent has, it's almost like the light goes off and it goes, why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I know that I could carry my child's car seat this way instead of this way? You know how many shoulders have been ruined for trying to strong arm it, when we now realizing that we could have just had the little hook deal going, right? Or finally figuring out someone created a snack bowl for kids where the snacks don't fall out. I don't care what a kid does, it just doesn't fall out because it's based on that ball design that always seems to cover itself. You know how many car seats could have been saved at that point because there was a parent in the room with a young child who constantly found themselves to be dirty? Like, how just incredible could that have been had the right people been at the table all the time? So what do you think happens then when you cut out a subset of people that they're never considered from the time that the idea was germinated to researching that idea to trying out and creating and testing different prototypes to actually creating what soon hits the market? How different things could have been had we had all the different kinds of people at the table. So when we think about design thinking, I think it's important to identify what those direct and those indirect needs are for all people that you may be designing for, okay? So when we're talking about design thinking, you're talking about interviewing, observing, and engaging in techniques to explore what other people need. We're actually going to explore what other people need. So when we're talking about those insights and those concrete observations, it's because we paid attention. It's because we looked and heard and understood what others needed. So I want you to think of design thinking as this never-ending wheel that goes on and on and on. So we find the need, we synthesize why it's important to have what's there. You ideate, you think about the process of going wide, you explore that broad space and talking about solutions, because no solution is a bad one. You just have to do all the experiments to figure out what it is that actually works. You get creative. I think about the person that created the bowl that never spilled. How many different things did they have to think about? Did they have to get on the ground and think like a child and play like a child? And, you know, what happens when the Cheerios don't go everywhere? Just what did it take? Creating the prototype. Creating that prototype so that someone could take it home and test it out and see how it really worked. Like when we think about the Kong, for example, I don't think they had tested it with enough dogs, because your Chihuahua, who is very small, could probably tear up a Kong pretty good. Where if you have another kind of dog that's pretty passive, he probably won't even touch the thing, right? But you got to prototype it, you got to try it out. You have to ask the stakeholders, you have to fail and try again, and fail again, and try again. Figure out what was successful, figure out what wasn't successful. Ask good questions, because good ideas come from good questions. You have to think about all of those different kind of problems that show up as we're trying to create things. We have to figure out if a pathway is visible or maybe even invisible to the naked eye. Would we even consider what happened until we actually consider what we hadn't considered before? And work out those real life problems to come up with some dope solutions. That's important. Stanford Design School even created their own thinking design process. And again, it's something that could be used in all areas of our life, where we begin to empathize with different groups of people. We begin to define what the challenges are, what the pain points are. We share ideas. We begin to think about what works using yes and as opposed to yes but or maybe, but considering all the different possibilities, mocking it up, creating it, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, and then testing it out with different kinds of people over and over and over again until you come up with that works. But in doing that, you want to make sure that you're also noticing and reflecting so that throughout the entire process, you are constantly keeping in mind other people, other individuals. So the notice phase helps with creating a self-awareness and a social emotional awareness before even thinking about the empathy part of the work that you're doing, that you're being aware of your own identity, your own values, your emotions, your biases, your assumptions, your situatedness. You are thinking about the context in which something is being created and developed. And from there, you can begin to peel back those layers so that you can say with humility and empathy, I didn't know that I didn't know what it was that I didn't know. And in doing that, creates the vulnerability and the space for others to step in and have that conversation. And so it becomes authentically human-centered and not just you-centered. The same thing goes with reflection, that as you reflect, you're often thinking about the process and how it's going to be ongoing. And that again, you're using your actions, your emotions, your insight, and your impact as a designer, as an engineer, to understand the context in which that item, that process, that product may even be used. You may even take a pause for a moment and ask yourself the question, is this process, is this product equitable for all people to be able to utilize? Or am I just catering to only one set of people or one group of people because we've only designed for this group? So with that being said, I want to show just a short video in regard to best practices in engineering where diversity, equity, and inclusion are determined in universal design. Yeah, this time.
Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Part 2, Universal Design. The U.S. Census Bureau projects that the future workforce pool will include more women, people of color, and non-U.S. born citizens. America is truly a melting pot, and it's one of our greatest strengths. However, in engineering, levels of gender, ethnic, and disability representation could be improved. In the past, design wasn't intended to exclude users, it just wasn't intended to include everyone either. Nowadays, we can do better. It's imperative that engineering designs are useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities.
In engineering specifically, we have to question the way that the system has been developed. It was developed without thinking about others, right? It was not developed thinking outside what the norm is.
So with universal design and with diversity, equity, inclusion, it's just very important that it's a part of not just HR processes, but the organizational processes.
But I think it's pretty clear when you walk into a design room or you're on a design team and you see everyone looks just like you, that's a problem.
In order to really put in the principles of universal design, you need to have everyone in the room. You need to make sure you're ensuring that someone's in the room that may be from a disenfranchised group. You're ensuring that someone's in the room that may have something that you've never heard of, right? So one of the engineering principles that comes out of this is you have to build something for any and all uses, foreseeable uses, as part of our code.
Universal design is good design, and it's good design for everyone. Universal design is as simple as a child in a playground making a game that everyone can play, right? It can be so simple, and it's truly like a connection between people and making sure that you're serving them with your design.
Dipped curbs, also known as curb cutouts, were not invented until 1967, when city planner Selwyn Goldsmith observed that people with disabilities were often unable to cross the street without assistance. A pilot project launched, and it quickly became apparent that a curb cutout not only improved the lives of people in wheelchairs, but also parents wheeling strollers, merchants using carts. This was a clear example that universal design is good design.
So one thing I like is not only the dip curve that is just easier for a wheelchair to go through, but the one that has the braille or the dots on it, because I'm a really busy person. I'm always multitasking, and sometimes those little dots really help me notice I'm getting really close to the edge. It's a very, very useful technology for more than just people in wheelchairs.
If I build a gadget, I want to make sure that everybody can use it, short, tall, big or small, you know, whatever race, whatever nationality. I want everybody to be able to use that in the same exact fashion.
On the research side of things, I specialize in affordable housing, and I look at equity in housing, but also universal design in housing. Can we make sure that everyone can live in these homes? We can do really small changes in the beginning of a project that can make a house so much more livable for such a longer period of time, where people won't need someone in there providing them assistance 24/7. Wider doorways, wider bathrooms that folks can get in and out, little grab bars. So installing a grab bar after the tile's put in place is much more costly than installing it before.
When you have diverse and inclusive thought, you get better products across the board.
If you don't include the people, as many people in a diverse group of folks when you're designing, you're going to make mistakes.
Today, machine learning and artificial intelligence are driving the fourth industrial revolution. It's critical that engineers building the algorithms powering this technology also practice the principles of universal design.
If you're looking at AI, right, you may have this group of, majority folks in the room that don't think about the problem of, hey, what if AI doesn't recognize a facial tone that is not the same, that's not white, right?
We know that there's a problem there. We know that there is a lack of diversity in that space. And we see that with like face recognition, how people of color, based off of our features aren't necessarily always captured in those frames. And one of the main reasons is because of the fact that we're not necessarily the ones behind the products or the works that's being designed.
It's commonly understood that many of the face IDs and other types of computer vision technologies didn't work well for people with darker skin tones originally, because they didn't have people with darker skin tones testing it or designing the infrastructure.
Whole thing behind machine learning is, what is the data that you're putting in? If you don't put in the right data, all of the data, not just the right data, all of the data, then what you get out is going to be trash.
As we continue to grow, as the generation continues to change, as AI and as tech continues to change, there's going to be a high need for adjustments to be made to design and processes internally.
The way I've seen it done best now is we'll go to a social scientist and we'll get a slew of questions, and then we'll put out a survey. We'll get the survey, we'll get the data back from the survey, and then that is what we incorporate into our algorithm design. And that's the best way I've seen it work so far.
There are going to be continuous iterations, like that's going to be the natural part of us getting it right.
Universal design is not a one-stop solution. You've got to continue to iterate. So if someone comes to you and says, I had a challenge with this, and this is, I think, how you can fix it, you go back and you redesign it, because you want to ensure, just like all engineering principles, we're building it for all uses.
If they don't adapt to the red flags that they're seeing or the gaps that they're seeing, then they risk falling behind.
Although we've talked a lot of doom and gloom about AI and machine learning, I think it offers the opportunity to remove bias. If we can ensure on the front end we give all of that data in, we take out the middleman, we take out the human error, and we allow the computer to make a prediction for us that includes everybody in our design.
We stand to gain a competitive advantage by including the voices that have typically been left behind in the past.
I think it's really important to think about our own personal lifestyles. And many times people label me as like an engineer, and I quickly remind them I'm a human being first, right? Before I engineer anything, I'm just a person. And one thing I do personally, outside of just focused on the engineering work I do, is trying to connect to culture and trying to connect to different cultures and connect to different people and being as humane as I can.
Universal design, good design, requires us as engineers to think beyond ourselves, to consider the end user, the people that we are trying to help with our design. America's strength is in our diversity. This includes our diversity of ideas. As engineers embrace the principles of universal design, we will continue to create a more inclusive world.
So I thought that this was a very helpful and very clear explanation of why it's important to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in design thinking. So with that being said, I think it's important that I now make you aware, okay, here we go, of the different people that you may not have known have impacted your everyday living. And this is just a very, very, very small snippet of innovators that have impacted science, technology, engineering, and math. Dr. Patricia Bath, I had the opportunity to meet her before she passed. She invented the laser phaco probe. If anyone has cataracts, they're going to use her process and her machine to help you with your cataracts. Has anyone ever had a super soaker? You can thank Lonnie Johnson for that. Lonnie Johnson invented the super soaker and the Nerf gun, tearing up homes across America, okay? He also holds 250 different patents. Garrett Morgan, if you've ever been angry in the morning, you can thank Garrett Morgan because he invented the traffic light. So much so that he later sold it to General Motors. If you have a home security system in your home, you can thank Marie Van Britten Brown. Along with her partner, Albert, they developed the home security system utilizing television surveillance, also known as CCTV. George Carruthers. George Carruthers invented the ultraviolet camera spectrograph. It traveled to the moon on Apollo 16 in 1972 to study the Earth's atmosphere. He was also given a congressional medal by President Barack Obama. All of us should thank Mark Dean because he's improved the PC. He holds 3 of the 9 original patents for IBM, 3 of the original 9, and another 20 PC-based patents, and invented the gigahertz chip. So all those pictures in one place, thank Mark Dean. Shirley Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a university president. She's a physicist, and she's an inventor. And she is responsible for the tech that we use. Touch-tone phones, I remember when they used to be rotary. And you had to turn the dial and wait for it to complete before you could go to the next number. And heaven forbid you got that number wrong. You had to start all over again. You'll be dialing for 15 minutes. But she also created the portable fax. She created call waiting. She created caller ID and the fiber optic cable. Oh, where would we be if we did not have caller ID? Where would we be if we did not have call waiting? Betty Harris. Betty Harris worked in the area of explosives, and she obtained a patent for her invention in spot testing and identifying explosives in a field environment. Anybody here have an Xbox or a PlayStation or a Nintendo Switch? You can thank Gerald Lawson. He invented the modern video gaming system. And he was the one that put into place having the interchangeable cartridges so that you can buy multiple games and play multiple games on your system. And guess what's still in place? You still have to go and buy multiple games. And that is a way that profits can be earned by video game developers. Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna is huge in Hollywood, but he's huge in Hollywood because he developed 3D graphics that we use in movies. Remember that first time you saw something in 3D, how it came out at you? And now it's much, much more sophisticated. He was the one behind the software firm Silicon Graphics, now SGI. Jesse Russell. Jesse Russell is one of the reasons why we can't get off of our phones today, because he helped to create 2G technology, which now is 5G technology. Valerie Thomas. Dr. Thomas is a NASA scientist who launched Landsat and LACY, the longest-running satellite program imaging Earth's surface. She was the pinnacle of doing this work. Her work has been used for over half a century at this point. That is mighty impressive for just a small subset of people. And yet, when I went back through and looked through the Library of Congress, and I looked at all the different kinds of patents and the different things that were made easier, a lot of them were because there was a need and it needed to be fulfilled. You know, the ironing board was created by a Black woman. The iron, the soup spoon, the ladle, all these different things. Heating and cooling, air conditioning, persons of color. That's who created it. And more times than not, they're not even acknowledged. So, what does this mean in the grand scheme of things? What does this mean? Well, I have a saying that if hands can build a system, then hands can dismantle one. But when you're talking about taking down a system to create a new one, it takes lots and lots of commitment by all scores of people, from the top and the bottom. It takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of resources. And by resources, I am talking time, space, money, and opportunity. And becoming a more complete and integrated society means being able to connect to those needs and those values. And that it also means embracing and learning about your own biases so that you can recognize them in real time as they're happening and you can disrupt them. It means expanding what you've learned in the classroom. I have a 7-year-old, and her favorite question is why? And she can go down the rabbit hole with why. But eventually, that rabbit hole leads us to going to the library and discovering all the things that we had not learned before. And now, how important is that to a 7-year-old? How much more important is it in your current way of life? We don't just go out and purchase something because why not? But we research it. Who's ever spent copious amounts of time looking at Amazon reviews for something? Okay? That's us doing our research. As a child, my father used to have a subscription to Consumer Reports. All right? Consumer Reports. What 6-year-old do you know used to read Consumer Reports? But that's where it starts. You get curious, you want to know more. Why not dig deep into that understanding? Wherever you can use your gift, use it to make change and create impact. And be willing to question how you got here. Be willing to question your own personal growth, your own commitment. And then once you have that answer, question again and again and again. We should be in a constant state of trying to figure out who we are, how we are, why we are, and is it making an impact? So in looking ahead, I want to leave 2 thoughts with you. The first being that once you see a situation, once you know the origin of something, you cannot unsee it. You now have to deal with it as it shows up for you. And once you've seen it, if you stay quiet, if you say nothing, if you don't act, that even in that moment, you are indeed acting. That is a political response in what you've seen, what you've heard, what you've experienced. That there is no innocence. That either you're in or you're out, but either way, you're accountable. And that's by Arundhati Roy. She's an author. But the one that I like the best, the quote that I like the best, is by Dr. Benjamin Lutz. He is a faculty member at Cal Poly College of Engineering, and he says, when you become aware of the problems related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering, it really becomes one's responsibility to dismantle the systems that perpetuate these inequities. You are officially responsible. And with that, I want to end my presentation, and I want to thank you for your rapt attention. So at this point, I want to give an opportunity to ask questions if you got them. Which I know can be really hard when it's being live streamed.
Well, I know we have one engineering person in here that's actually been in the field. So I guess it's not really a direct. Oh. Thank you. People on the live stream can hear you. Okay. Thank you. So I think it's on.
He's turning it on.
Is it on now? Oh, I hear it now. Thank you. So this is not really a question for you. This is actually a question for Dr. Jensen, who is the chair of the Civil and Architectural Engineering Department, and also actually the chief advisor of our Tau Beta Pi.
Yeah.
So I know I think you're the only engineer in this right here that's worked for odd plus years. So have you seen ways that diversity and inclusion has impacted your work as a civil engineer with bridges and roads and concrete testing and all that sort of stuff? Or is there things that you've seen that do need changing?
I think what I first have to recognize is that I have had a tremendous amount of mentors that have always wanted to put me first, and that is really where it starts. And being able to believe in your ideas, and thinking through suggestions that you have, And the goal is to recreate those environments for our students, to give them that space. And in education, in engineering, there are certain courses that are very procedural. You have to learn how to analyze a framing system so that it can withstand the loads that you have to put on it. But we do have many courses where we have room for these discussions, and the more we know about how to address this and make it better for future project, future generation of engineers, that is just so important to us. I still see that in my field, we have a very low number of female engineers. There are lower numbers of participation, people of color, so there is just so much more we still can achieve, and it's our role to figure out a way to show that we actually have the whole community involved and the whole cross-section of the population involved, and I think that still is a big challenge.
Thank you, and thank you for just being a big supporter of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I appreciate that. Any more questions? Thoughts, comments, concerns? Oh, thank you.
There are no questions in the live stream.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you for checking that.
So thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure for me. When Erica first asked, I'm like, okay, sure. And then I thought, okay, wait, I need to do some homework because there's so much that's out there. And I know that that's only a small, like a very, very small piece of what we're even beginning to learn. We're just barely scratching the surface with all of that, with everything that we're learning. But I firmly believe that the more we learn, the better that all the things that are brought into fruition will be. I firmly believe that. I firmly believe that. And as long as we keep allowing people to come to the table and we allow people to say what they need to say and show us why something is important, it begins to really open the door wide to be inclusive of all different kinds of people to be able to become an engineer. I know that for a number of friends that I've had that have gone to college and became engineers, either found themselves disillusioned from the experiences that they were having because of the cultural context, or felt strongly enough that they struck out on their own and decided to make a way when there was no way. It says a lot to the heart of the matter, and that we've often had to work really, really hard just to even be acknowledged. I thought a lot about the light bulb while I was doing this work, and thinking about Thomas Edison, and thinking about all of those other inventors, and wondering, well, who else should be getting these accolades but just aren't because of what society said was unacceptable, or what society said, they shouldn't be the ones to be able to do that, the all-encompassing we said versus they said, and the othering of the different kinds of genius that show up for all people and all different ways of life. It makes me think about the movie Something the Lord Made, which is the incredible story of Vivian Thomas from the Vanderbilt University, who was the one that created this remarkable procedure with helping blue babies. And yet the accolades were taken by Dr. Blaylock, because Vivian was a janitor, but he was pushed into that role of being a janitor because that was the only way that he could get the education that he sought, because he wanted to become a surgeon. And about the countless other lives of individuals that have been disrupted in one way or another because of the discrimination that was systemic. You know, there's lots of information that's out there. But again, if we can build a system, we can tear it down and make it anew. So thank you again for letting me have this opportunity. And I look forward to the next one. Thank you. Thank you.